Hi, Russ of AquariumX here, and today we're going to talk about various methods for controlling fungus gnats. But let's back up for just a second. What are fungus gnats and why do we need to control them in the first place? Well, fungus gnats, as the name implies, are small flying insects that are attracted to fungus. And what that means is that potting soil for houseplants, terrarium and vivarium substrates, simple cocoa fiber, any other soil or soil-like substrates that we use in our enclosures or for houseplants are naturally colonized by fungus. That's pretty much inevitable, and because that is the case, fungus gnats will be attracted to those materials, and fungus gnats live everywhere, and they will make their way through window screens as if they were not there. And so anyone who keeps quantities of substrates that are made of cocoa fiber or anything like compost, soil, potting soil, anything like that, ABG mix, will almost inevitably find that fungus gnats make their way into their enclosures. Now, fungus gnats themselves are in general not very harmful. They can just be a nuisance. They fly around, they get into things, they show up everywhere. A lot of people are annoyed by them. But if they were to reproduce to the point where their populations were really high, and they will reproduce readily in these substrates unless they're controlled, that could be a problem because they will start opportunistically feeding on things we wouldn't want them to feed on. So controlling them is a good idea to make sure they don't get out of hand. So let's talk about the first method of control, and that is essentially preventing them from entering an enclosure in the first place. Okay? Now, here is a very popular enclosure for isopods, these shoe boxes. You can see that I have ventilated the enclosure, drilled a hole into here, and I've got another hole in the back covered with chiffon. Chiffon is a very fine fabric, much finer than window screen, because as I mentioned, fungus gnats can go right through window screen. They can't go through chiffon. So I've used this aluminum tape to tape it on there, and the thing is, they cannot enter through the ventilation holes per se, but because this lid is not particularly tight fitting, they can make their way through. So the entrance of fungus gnats in a container like this shoebox style container, even though I love this container for many reasons, that's the one downfall of this container. Fungus gnats can get in. So let's look at another container. Now this is a plastic food saver container with a much tighter seal. When this is sealed correctly, fungus gnats can't get in. And so I have chiffon again and Nashua aluminum tape. I'll put a link in the description of this particular type of tape that I use. As long as I do that and this container is sealed correctly, fungus gnats can't get in. However, if this is left open for some reason, whether it's because you're in there doing maintenance or you forget and don't seal it completely, whatever, it just takes one gravid female fungus gnat getting in there and then you will have fungus gnats. So it's really important to make sure it's sealed correctly. There's another container here I'd like you to see. I'll put a link in the description to this one as well. Now this container was drilled for juvenile snakes, so these holes would totally admit fungus gnats. But you could drill holes and then cover them with chiffon like I've done in the other containers there, and this could be very suitable for isopods or other animals with a soil-like substrate because of its gasket seal. And let me show you what I mean. In the lid here, all around it, there's a closed cell foam ring or gasket, and when you put that on the container and then you snap down these closures, that's very tight. So fungus gnats can't get in through that seal, and as long as you have chiffon covering all other ventilation, that this container should be quite secure from fungus gnats. Once again, all it takes is one fungus gnat to enter. So although what I've talked about so far is an important component of controlling fungus gnats, it's not the only measure you should take. Another point that I wanted to make quickly is that fungus gnats prefer humid, moist enclosures. If you have a lot of ventilation in your enclosure like this is window screen, again, fungus gnats can travel through window screen quite easily, but because this enclosure is kept very well ventilated and also fairly dry, I don't have a lot of issues with fungus gnats here. So more arid enclosures, really not so much to worry about there. And even if the enclosure has a moist spot, I've noticed that there's enough ventilation, the fungus gnats are not attracted as much, maybe because the air circulation helps to prevent the fungal growth they're attracted to, something like that. So that's a part of the equation as well. But now let's move on to trapping fungus gnats. Okay, I'm going to show you this particular method that I use, and I'll put links in the description to this item. These are fly ribbons, and there are a couple of different brands that you can get, but no insecticides are used in these. I wouldn't want to use insecticides in conjunction with my invertebrates, of course. That doesn't seem like a very good idea, does it? But these do not contain any insecticides. They're a mechanical trap. Let me show you what I mean. There is a ribbon coiled up in here. There's a little pin, a push pin, so you can hang this from your ceiling. You press this in, and there's a little plastic ring here. And the plastic ring, you put your push pin through there, and then you remove this little cap and very carefully unwind this tape. And if you've never used these before, these are extremely sticky, so be careful not to touch it with your bare hands. If you do, you've got to use like vegetable oil or something like that to help you get it off. And as you can see, very, very sticky. This sort of orangey, yellow, browny, whatever color you'd call it, tape naturally attracts fungus gnats. They will land on it even without any additional bait or anything like that. And so you just hang this from your ceiling in a place where you're not going to bump into it, because believe me, bumping into it is not pleasant. And I hang these in the closet where I keep my isopods. I have 4 shelves hanging in my set up in my closet. The isopods are on the shelves. Almost all my isopods are in there. And I just stick this up in each corner of the closet, and fungus gnats are attracted to it and they get stuck. Now, the fungus gnats themselves will eventually cover the tape if it sits there long enough, and after a while this tape will lose its stickiness. So I recommend that based on your situation, which may vary depending on humidity and lighting and the air circulation in the area and how many fungus gnats you have, you're just going to need to figure out how often you need to replace these, but you will need to replace them periodically, and they really, really help control fungus gnats. Now, you can get other types of sticky traps for fungus gnats. Some of them are flat cards, and you just peel off like a plastic cover, and then fungus gnats are attracted to those. Some people even stick those on the underside of the lid of their isopod enclosures. That's not a bad idea as long as you ensure that isopods are not going to come in contact with that surface. Because if they do come in contact with that sticky surface, they will get stuck too, and they will be hurt or possibly killed by that. So take whatever steps you need to make sure that your isopods are not going to get stuck. Personally, I stick with these because I feel like they will not endanger the isopods because they're not in the enclosures where the isopods are. But I'll put links in the description to this one and some other options for you in terms of traps. Before we move on to some other techniques for controlling fungus gnats, I wanted to point out that this video is a response to a question from one of our Patreon supporters. So I want to thank Mads for asking this question, and I want to thank all of our patrons at Patreon for all of the support that you offer this channel. We really couldn't do it without you. So please keep up the good work. We really, really appreciate it. So now let's move on to outcompeting fungus gnats. There are a couple of ways we can do that. Now, one way that I've mentioned in many of my other videos is through springtails. Springtails are an excellent way to help keep fungi under control because that is one of their natural foods. They eat mold and other types of fungi as well as other decomposing material. And if you add them to just about any enclosure, they're not going to harm the inhabitants of the enclosure, as you have to worry about with some species. As cleanup crews, they can harm your inhabitants, but springtails will not do that. They are extremely harmless, but they are also quick to reproduce. And because they eat the same things that fungus gnats do, if you put a nice healthy population of springtails into an enclosure from the outset, you are likely to reduce or eliminate problems from fungus gnats because the fungus gnats simply won't have much to eat. So it is important to get those springtails in there quickly because the fungus gnats are so opportunistic. If you wait to put springtails in an enclosure, you might find that the fungus gnats have a very healthy population pretty quickly, and that's not what you want. So springtails, definitely a good option to consider. Another manner of out-competition that maybe people don't think of as often is that isopods themselves can be a great way to outcompete fungus gnats, but you have to have a really healthy population that finishes food off quite quickly. I've noticed, for example, dairy cows are one of the most prolific isopods there are. And I have a culture of dairy cows that is very mature. There are a lot of isopods in there, and I really don't have problems with fungus gnats in there. They don't appear to be breeding in there at all. They might wander in there once in a while, but they do not breed in there because the dairy cows eat up everything that they would otherwise eat. And honestly, I think the dairy cows would probably eat the eggs and or larvae. They're very voracious. So a healthy, established population of isopods will also help outcompete fungus gnats. I would say that the newer cultures of isopods, and this holds true for some other invertebrates as well, is much more vulnerable to issues with fungus gnats just because they haven't gotten to the point where they're really effectively outcompeting them. So we've already discussed mechanical traps to reduce fungus gnat populations, but there are also some live traps that we could consider as well. Some of the carnivorous plants are quite effective at catching fungus gnats. One that I've kept is called Drosera capensis. It's also known as the Cape sundew. And this is a plant with small droplets of sticky fluid on the end of small hairs, and it will wrap its leaves around things like fungus gnats, fruit flies, house flies, and so on. So it's been a few years since I kept one, but they do eat fungus gnats, so that could be an interesting method in your arsenal to control fungus gnats if you want to look into that. Of course, Drosera capensis, they have their own care requirements, so you'd have to make sure that you're able to provide those, but it could be an interesting way to help combat fungus gnats. And though I haven't kept it, it might be worth looking up the Mexican butterwort, another carnivorous plant that is said to eat fungus gnats. So both are options you might want to consider in a multi-pronged approach to fungus gnat control. And now let's talk about what is probably the most effective means of biological control that I am aware of for controlling fungus gnats. Now, there is a type of bacterium known as Bacillus thuringiensis israelensis, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, that is sold as mosquito bits. And basically what this is a type of formulation on corn granules, I believe it is, and mixed with this bacteria. So what you can do is take these corn granules, soak them in purified water. I take maybe a quarter of a cup of purified water and just sprinkle 7 to 10 granules into that water, and then let it sit there for an hour or two. And then I carefully pour off some of that water into the substrate of whatever I'm keeping that might attract fungus gnats. So specifically, I have mostly used mine in with millipedes and with crickets, because to raise crickets you provide an egg-laying medium, which in my case is cocoa fiber, and fungus gnats are attracted to moist cocoa fiber, as I mentioned. So I pour a little bit of this in, and I have noticed a dramatic effect on the fungus gnats. The nice thing about this is because it's bacterial and very, very specific in this case, this type of bacteria only targets larval flies. It's not even dangerous to adult stage of the flies. It's the only vulnerable organisms are the larvae of flies, and it attacks their digestive system essentially and kills them. So I have used this with millipedes without any harm to the millipedes, with crickets without any harm to crickets, and so on. And basically you put some of this concoction that I mentioned in the substrate about every week, and if you do that, it really, really makes a difference in reducing the number of fungus gnats. And I will put a link in the description to this. Make sure that you follow instructions and directions, and also realize that your mileage may vary depending on your specific situation, and I haven't tested it with all the species that I keep. I did read one study where it seemed that with Porcellonides pruinosus isopods, it was very effective at reducing fungus gnats and didn't kill the isopods, except in cases where a high concentration was poured directly on the isopod, and that may not be the bacteria itself, but something else that's going on. So I would caution against pouring the liquid directly on your millipedes, isopods, whatever. Just make sure it gets into the substrate. And again, your mileage may vary, use at your own risk, but so far for me, it's been a very, very useful weapon in the battle against fungus gnats. So what do you think? Have you tried any of these methods? Do you have other methods that I haven't mentioned? Please let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching today. I post videos every Wednesday and Friday, all on aquarium and vivarium pets. Please feel free to share, rate, comment, and if you haven't already,
subscribe.
And then click the bell icon so you don't miss my next video.